Ni ska ju vara med idag och vara aktiva. Men nu så ska vi få höra ett jättespännande område. Vår första talare idag, han är ansvarig för Dansk Designcenter som arbetar för att stärka värdet av design både för företag och samhället i stort i Danmark.
There we go. Having worked for 8 years with innovation and design inside government at Mindlab, I would say the notion of just implementing, it's a little bit harder than that. Easier said than done, you might say. So this is not really working too well. That's what happens when you give a PDF slide, I suppose. I wonder how we do this. Maybe we can make it work like this. Let's see. Just wanted to say very briefly, so as we heard earlier, my background was to run Mindlab, the Danish government's innovation team, for about 8 years. This is an image from Mindlab over here. And of course, government innovation spaces need to be white. You need to have a little bit of funky furniture, a few funky lamps, and then you throw some designers and ethnographers in there, and then you have a lab. I'll tell you a little bit more about labs at the end of my presentation, but there's no doubt that it seems that these teams, innovation labs, are on the rise, also inside government organizations these days. Speaking of funky lamps, this is the Danish Design Center, or at least what it used to look like. We're just moved out of that building, but as was mentioned, the center exists to strengthen how we use design in business and society in Denmark. And so, in a sense, that's a broad national platform for design, a sister organization, essentially, of SVID here in Sweden. Well, and that's the business school down there. I guess that kind of works. All right. So here are some of the publications, and I would say that what was mentioned also earlier is that it's interesting that the European Commission, and actually also now the United Nations and World Bank and other, World Economic Forum and other global organizations are beginning to look at how design can be used in new contexts and new ways. So as Robin said, there might be a gap, but that the quality or nature and the dimensions of that gap between who is, let's say, has design skills and competencies and who is commissioning, buying design, that is really, really changing. And it's a really fascinating time for design, I think. This is the book or the publication that maybe has inspired a little part of the title today. This is supposed to be a discount code, so you don't pay 70 euros for the book, but you pay 40 or 50. So write it down or photograph it, or we can tweet it for this event. But there's a chance to get it at least at a lower cost. But the reason we wrote this book, this is an anthology, so I really didn't write it. I just edited it. Was to say, well, something seems to be going on with design, where it is no longer, so to speak, just about services, but it's about something bigger than that. And this is not to diminish that ultimately what matters is how citizens, users experience interactions between themselves and government. But it is to say that every single time you explore a public service interaction, or you could actually say every time you explore any service interaction, also in the private sector, that interaction comes from somewhere. And when we talk about government policy or government services, the nature of the interaction is, in a sense, the accumulated result of many, many, many things which you might ultimately call policy. So, for example, how we fund government services, how we educate professionals in government, or social workers, health workers, teachers, and so on. It's a result of the regulation and the governance and the rules that dominate a particular field. It's a result of how we've organized our public institutions and organizations. It is a result of how we measure impact or measure activities or measure value, and how people are incentivized, as for example as social workers, to be extremely busy in getting people through a certain activity or whatever. So the service experience that you have as an individual when you encounter a public organization is really the result of many, many things that are done by government. which means that in the individual interaction, when you look at that, you actually see the seeds of something that is the top-level macro decisions about a whole policy area. So if you want to change the service, if you want to change the service experience, it's not enough to educate the frontline workers. It's not enough to reorganize the processes. It's not enough even to throw more funding at it or something like that. You probably will have to get into changing regulation, changing governance, changing structures. And that's not something you just do, is it? But it's probably necessary if you want to change how we as citizens experience government. So that was the curiosity, or that was the starting point to me when we talked about design for policy. And I totally agree that if we did integrate design as part of the practice of conducting the work of government, that would be a revolution. And that is what we're experimenting with different places. And in fact, the reason I changed jobs and took on the job to lead the Danish Design Center is that we are a publicly funded body that could probably use a bit of design in the way we run our institution. In other words, that how might we use design to run the Danish Design Center is the question. Or how might we use design to run Danish innovation policy is the bigger question. I promise to only speak for about 20, it's probably going to be about 25 minutes, but I really hope that you'll think about your questions, about what you want to say, or anything you want to comment on, because we will have time for that. So I'll try to be brief, and I won't give you too many examples because they'll just take a lot of time. I'll give you a few. But first of all, just to say, why is it so challenging to work with public problems as opposed to some extent to private sector problems? Now, the more I work now also with the private sector, I must say that business problems can be pretty much as complex as government problems. But I do tend to agree with John Dewey here, the American philosopher, that some of the hardest problems are the ones that are public. And these are problems that cut across domains of society. These are problems that are, as we say today, complex or systemic problems. And they're problems that don't really seem to go away. So every morning when I drive or take the train into Copenhagen, I kind of wonder, when I listen to the news and the news stories, that I've heard those stories before. It's kind of the problem with getting older. I've passed 40 already, so I feel I'm getting older. And you think, we still have 800,000 people in Denmark on public pensions and public support who are in the working age. We still have unemployment rates that are too high, especially among the young. This year we cannot find private vocational placements for young trainees, and that was the same last year, and last year, and last year, and last year. And oh, by the way, for 40 years in Denmark, we have not made a dent at all in how we deal with people who have a drug addiction. We have not become more successful in dealing with drug addiction in 40 years. And I could probably go on with our school system, and I will in a moment, and so on. And when you listen to those radio stories, you wonder, how is it that we're not getting any better? And I would say, if you want to make, and those of you who are here from the government, if you want to make the argument for why should we try out design for policy, it's because it's not going so well right now, is it? And is there something here that offers us a different approach? A radically different approach to what we've tried so far? It might be worth trying out. And the reason I put it that way is that we can put up a lot of case stories, we can even put up some metrics and some business cases, but ultimately what I am experiencing in practice that convinces public managers to take on design and use it to transform their services is that fundamentally they are dissatisfied with how it's going, they are not satisfied with failing, and they're ambitious to make more of a change. And if you're that kind of manager or that kind of human being, you should take a look to design and what it might do for you. Because we're dealing with problems that are, some of the authors in the book say they're super wicked, which means they're not just complex in individual domains, but they actually cut across domains. So you combine social stratification with globalized workforce, you combine that with the financial crisis, and you combine that with environmental challenges, and you get something pretty nasty. they are also, we have built a public sector built on silos of ministries and agencies and departments. We've also built a public sector based on siloed knowledge domains. So we have the lawyers here, we have the economists here, we have maybe some political scientists here, we have professionals in environment, in education, in social work here, and they don't really speak very well together now, do they? And part of the reason we have the problems we have is that we're simply not able to systematically, effectively collaborate across the silos, not just of organizations, but of professions. Because we miss a profession that has a different function, has a different role, one of integrating, one of developing, one of rethinking, one of challenging, one of creating synthesis between different knowledge domains. And guess what that profession is? That's design. It's one of the only professions we have that has the job of integrating different skills, different skill sets, different technologies, different experiences into one single solution or set of solutions. And finally, we built the public sector to prioritize stability. We built the public sector to be that anchor in society that does not change too much. And that's probably a good thing. And I'm not here to say we should throw everything on its head. If you look at the Middle East these days, some people have tried to throw government on its head, and it doesn't always work out that well. They would probably, in some of those countries right now, they would probably love a bit of stability. So stability is a good thing, but stability is not a good thing when that stability is out of touch and out of tune with how society is changing and becomes a liability or a risk factor, actually. When it becomes a risk factor in people's lives. That because government is stable, it cannot support and facilitate positive human change. So stability is kind of a dual-edged sword that way. As a public manager, though, and as a public employee, a lot of people, in my experience, are finding themselves navigating in a fog. We've used that term recently at the Danish Design Center to describe how decision makers in business are navigating in a fog when they look at how technology is changing, how globalization is changing the conditions for business. But that fog, that difficulty in looking forward and seeing what's in front of us is pretty much the same when you look as a metaphor for how managers are dealing in the public sector. We can't really see what's happening. And maybe the reason for the lack of change is that we're not courageous enough in reaching out into that fog and trying something out. So in this wonderful book, Managing as Designing, a couple of guys, Boland and Colopy, are saying that managers in many ways are thrown into situations that are not of their own making, but where they have to make decisions. And so ultimately, design for policy, design for strategy, design for any kind of organizational change is really about how do we make decisions and where do the decisions come from. So, you know, how many of you in a position where you make decisions? Okay, that's about half of it, at least, you know. And the rest of you are also managers. You don't feel you're making any decisions. When I worked in the Ministry of Business, inside the ministry, we had a strategy seminar with all the mid-level managers, and we talked about this strategy seminar. It was just when I started my job, and somebody was saying, you know what? It really doesn't make sense at all that we are here doing a strategy seminar because we don't do strategy. I was thinking. I came from the private sector. I worked in a private consulting firm for a while. I thought to myself, what are they talking about? But a lot of mid-level managers, and this was the case here, felt that they do not in any way influence or make strategy. What they do is they execute strategy on behalf of the minister, on behalf of the permanent secretary. And they're basically passively executing, having apparently no knowledge, no insight, no experience whatsoever that might have any influence or could have any influence on what the strategy is. That was kind of surprising to me. Okay, so to understand the context of designing for government, I would say we need to understand that a lot of people in government, advising government, in academia, are already now saying that the public sector is changing. Not just needs to change, but it is changing. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of the directions in which it seems to be changing. Before I do that, though, I would say that as an example of that change, example of that kind of new governance paradigm, there is the Danish national school reform. And I worked on that as a part of MindLab. when we were advising the Ministry for Education in Denmark on school reform. This is the biggest reform of the public school system in Denmark in a generation, at least in a generation, maybe ever. And that reform was orchestrated by the ministry in two very, very different ways. And just to illustrate that there are two approaches to change. One way was what you might expect, right? So legislation put forward in parliament, lots of political negotiation with the different parties, quite brutal, tough approach to teachers, in actually kicking teachers out of the schools for about a month because to enforce new rules on how they spend their time and how they're paid, which of course made teachers slightly frustrated, and they still are with the reform. The reform also involved a lot of sort of top-down work on giving guidelines and ideas to how should the schools be working with the reform. And then there was a different approach happening at the same time. And that approach was called the New Nordic School. Has anyone heard of the New Nordic School? Okay, interesting. Because, of course, New Nordic meant that it was not just a Danish idea. It was actually supposed to be part of a Nordic movement around school reform. And the idea with the New Nordic School was to, why don't we just invite schools, invite local institutions together in networks to explore the future of education, and we will support you, we will fund you, we will run conferences, we'll build tools, we'll build design tools for you, we'll build your skills, and it's all voluntary. As one of our advisors at MindLab told us, or said, he said, but basically it's like two different ways of working with energy. The first way, the classic reform way, is to push the energy from the center, from the system, from the ministry, out into the world and tell teachers, schools, institutions, do this. It's also called top-down, right? And what sometimes happens with that kind of energy is that it's kind of reflected and it goes back right at you. And that's what's a little bit what's happening in Denmark right now too. It's coming right back in the face of the minister, right in the face of politicians, in the face of administrators, and not in a good way. Then you have the other kind of energy, which is that you simply build power stations and build distributed systems of energy bottom up or locally. And you create enthusiasm, motivation, engagement in a voluntary way. 350 institutions in Denmark, both primary schools, which are part of the reform, but also daycare and also upper and secondary education, joined the movement of the New Nordic School. And the difficulty, of course, is as policymakers, how do you work with something as fragile and as voluntarily as this kind of movement at the same time as you work with something as top-down and as tough as the reform? But these are two very, very different ways of working with policy, and maybe the trick is, to some extent, to work with both, because you probably can't do big reforms without part of both, but maybe we should shift the balance more to the latter, to the New Nordic approach. So that's about focusing on citizens' resources. These are just some examples of the kind of terminology and the words that are being used about government reform. It's about looking at welfare or public services not as something that are delivered to people or that are transactional. Just like you go into banks and you have a transaction, you enter your code and you get money out of the bank if you have money in the bank. But that they're relational. Because going to school for 10 years in a school and building relationships with teachers and professionals and your peers and other students and students' parents and so on, that's a relational task. That's not a transaction. It's not a delivery of an education. It's a relational process of learning, what it is. The same goes for spending time in a hospital. That's not a transaction where somebody just cuts in you and puts you out again. It's really in many ways a relational thing. It's a human thing. It's an emotional thing. It's an experience thing. So how do you work in a hospital with different standards for quality that are not defined by professionals, but are defined by the human experience of being a patient being a human being in a hospital environment? That's the question. And that question is, for example, being raised by the director of the Danish National Hospital System. What would it look like if we didn't pay hospitals to be very quick at doing things to people, but we paid hospitals for the experiences they create, or even, this is crazy I know, but even if we paid hospitals to make people healthy? It goes to show how, what you pay for and how you incentivize actually matters in policy. In Denmark right now, we're paying hospitals to be busy doing operations on people. We're not paying them based on whether they get healthy or not. Or outcome-based welfare, which means that how would we create a welfare system, and being in Sweden, you know what I'm talking about, that is not based on the rights to a service, but based on the right to an outcome. So in Denmark, for example, there's been major discussion on whether an older citizen who's receiving public care should have the right to 2 baths a week, or 3 showers a week, or 1 shower a week. You might also say that you have the right to feel clean, or the right to thrive, or the right to be comfortable. And for some people, that would probably be 7 showers a week, and for others, it might be a shower every 2 weeks. I don't know. Who are we to decide? But what would a care system look like that was based on outcomes rather than on activities? So designing for policy. How many of you in this room would you say, are designers? Okay, so I'm halfway preaching to the choir right now. So very briefly, just on how do we define what design is, here's some definitions that I like. And I know there are so many definitions we could go on for the rest of the day on what is design. But actually, the dictionary quote on policy, try to see this one. Does this, from Charles Eames, the designer, not look very much like a definition of policy, actually? Drawing up a plan to achieve a particular purpose by arranging certain elements. Elements could be law, could be finance, could be organization, could be competencies for service creation. To me, it is incredibly inspiring to look at excellent designers who are famous for designing chairs, who have an articulation of what design is that is applicable for business and policy spaces and social spaces that people typically don't think of. Of course, that doesn't mean that, the interesting thing is then, what does it mean to draw up a plan in a designerly way and not in a way that an MBA would have done it, or a political scientist like myself would have done it? That's maybe the question. So what is a good design process or a powerful design process? What is even a design process that might lead to actual change? What does that look like, right? So here are some of the properties of ways in which I believe that design and designers can do what they do work and can work in terms of addressing public problems. And what I want to just spend a little bit of time on is the experimental part and the prototyping that was also mentioned in the beginning here. Speaking of experiments, because in many ways I would say that the design process is an experimental one in the sense that it tests out and tries assumptions, propositions with users, with those that will use or be impacted by a certain design, and then learning rapidly, iteratively, whether this is a good idea or not. Actually, in government, it's often a radical notion to say that an idea, especially one coming from the top, from a director, from a permanent secretary, maybe even from a politician, and now it's getting, of course, tricky, that design can help us find out if an idea is any good. And one of the reasons why on the news you hear so many stories of public services that are breaking down and not working is that no one actually ever stopped to check whether a policy idea was any good. Not really. The checking if an idea is any good is normally if you can write a beautiful memo explaining the idea in a 3-point plan, then it's probably good. Because it's all done by political scientists like me. As one guy, a manager in the Danish tax ministry, by the way, which is finally now hiring service designers, said to me a while ago, said, actually, you know what? Any of our solutions, any of them, would be so much better if we just walked out the street, down to the local train station, grabbed any 4 random citizens and checked it out with them. Anything would be better than what we're doing now, which is pretty much nothing. He's one of the people hiring designers now. So Bolan Culleby has this other really nice quote, which is to say that approaching problem solving with a design attitude, and there's a new book out, by the way, called Design Attitude. You should check it out, Google it. Design Attitude by Camille McCloskey from the UK. He was a student of theirs and looked at what is design attitude and looked at how designers work, what is the culture of design work. And there's a lot of, I think, of inspiration to draw from that. But this is going back essentially to saying, if you as a public manager or public employee have that resolve to make the world a better place than you found it, then that is already the beginning. It's a beginning of being curious about how might design maybe help. So the prototyping, to me, is an important concept for us to understand in the public sector, because we already do piloting. But a prototype is not the same as a pilot. Pilot is something that we've done for decades in the public sector, right? Where we try to demonstrate or create evidence of that a policy will work or is working. Where we do it once we're pretty sure that the solution is right, because we've written the memo and we've had the negotiations and we involved the lobbyists and the stakeholders and we had it through parliament. And if it's in Sweden, we've had a lot of coffee. Yeah? Lots and lots and lots of coffee, lots of talk. And then we're sure we agree. We don't know if it works actually, but we agree. So now I'm going to put it out there. And then we say it's a pilot, because of course we can't just do the whole thing. We do a pilot of 1,000 people, 2,000 people. We do a pilot in a local community. We do 10 pilots in 10 different places. Problem with pilots is they're so public that when you do them, you can't really roll it back. And if they fail, it hits the minister, it hits the councilman, or it's nasty. Failure is always nasty. Public failure in government is nasty. It gets kind of bloody at some point. But a prototype, on the other hand, is something we do when we're not sure. When we have not had that much coffee yet, when we have not discussed so much, when we're not so sure. And in government, that is really, really challenging. At MindLab, it took us 1.5 years to convince the Ministry of Employment to begin to prototype how they did policy, which meant they would have to involve industrial partners, the labor unions, at an early stage when they were not so sure about the policy. It's a radical notion for a ministry that is focusing on controlling information and focusing on controlling process and opening up. But what other alternative is there than to begin to test things at an early stage if we want to be sure or have a higher certainty that it works? So prototyping is a way to introduce more certainty really into the innovation process or into the policy process. And the risk is low. That does not mean that one might pilot at some point. That could be, I don't know. But I think prototyping is what really matters. So an example of prototyping we did with the Danish school reform. And this was even the top-down part of the reform. This was not so much the New Nordic School. This was really the top-down part, which is to say that all teachers in Denmark must use a new digital platform for setting learning objectives for kids. This is a prototype of the digital platform. As you can see, it's a pretty early stage. It's not really very digital yet. It's basically a design game where policymakers, teachers, administrators at local level can engage with each other to understand what should be the functions, the value, and the practice of this kind of platform. And the design game was created on the basis of ethnographic interviewing and observation studies in a number of schools and administration to look at how are teachers doing things today. And in that dialogue, and there's several-hour workshop between the teachers and policymakers, they could then play around with all kinds of concepts that were becoming concrete. A grabber, the fork, which would allow you to grab different types of information from one knowledge domain, let's say mathematics, into another domain like Danish. There would be the magic straw, which would sort of give you access to some online databases. There would be a calculator that might calculate learning levels, and so on and so on. All kinds of abstract notions that you could play around with and say, what do you need? And then further down the process, of course, then you do wireframes and you begin to do sort of concept development for the actual interaction interface and so on. But speaking of policy, what happened here was suddenly that one of the teachers almost started crying. And she didn't start crying over that somebody was stabbing her with a fork or there was a difficult process. No. She basically said something that had relevance for policy, which was, we're doing this now, and you want to implement this by August 1st, this whole digital system that we're now co-designing. But guess what? We're already so stressed, so messed up by this whole reform that there's no chance at all we can implement a new digital platform at the same time. We can't do it. And so what we finally did, which was very unlike us at MindLab, was we wrote a memo to the minister saying, you should probably postpone this whole process by a whole year to allow for a sequenced implementation of this whole reform. Otherwise, you're going to have problems. And that's what they did. So we discovered a sequencing of policy that was really critical just through the exploration of this new future. And it was a surprise to us, but it meant that there was a big change, of course, in the reform. Finally, just the last comment before we can have some opening up the questions. I'm finding that to lead public design and to lead design for services and policy, there's some things that managers need to be good at in terms of engaging. I would call it design engagement, not making managers into designers, but helping managers engage with design. And this is some of the stuff I've been researching at the Copenhagen Business School, where there's basically 3 things that design helps us do. Design helps us explore the problem space. So what's the nature of the problem and the context we're looking at? Secondly, design helps us, as you know, of course, to generate ideas, scenarios, new concepts, new types of solutions. And finally, this is getting back to the realization or implementation side. Design helps us enact new practices. But let me give you 3 examples of how public managers are relating to that and what I think is important. So these are the 3 major processes that design can help us with, and these are some of the design engagements or design attitudes, you might even call them, that managers probably need to use design. This is what it takes for managers to really skillfully work with designers. So one first example is from Christina here from a institution for adult mentally handicapped in Denmark. They won the National Award for Innovation a while ago for local government. And she basically says, when you explore the problems and when you look at what is the situation today, when you do that kind of design research, her ambition was to change things for the better for the users. Speaking of mission user. And if she was to make a choice to lay off a staff member in order to do what's right for her adult mentally handicapped users, she would do that. And when she said this to me in an interview, she explained that she had to lay off a new hire, who was hired on a contract for 2 years to do theater for these adult mentally disabled users. But when they involved the users in co-designing what they wanted to do in the institution, no one, not a single person wanted to do theater. You could of course just say, well, I just hired somebody to do theater, you're going to do theater and force it on them. Or you could say, I'm making a choice here. So she had to fire that person she just hired. Because she realized that when you step in the user's shoes, that creates new energy and new momentum. This institution now has a waiting list for the first time in 40 years of existence. They have a waiting list of adult mentally handicapped over in Odense. Let's get this bit down here. So another example of, this is an example of exploring the problem space, but actually also beginning to get new ideas, was to a homelessness service in the UK, where the manager insisted, why don't we video film, and this was done by a design firm, by Think Public, a design firm, why don't we video film interactions between staff and citizens? And when you video film what you do in service interactions, you always realize that something doesn't work. In this case, they discovered things about policy-wise between transitions between when people are young and homeless and they're old and homeless. There was a total silo between what happened to the 2 groups. They also discovered that they were asking children to translate, children of ethnic minorities to translate conversation between their parents who were homeless and the staff. And you're not supposed to do that. So that takes a lot of courage, I would say, on behalf of the manager, but also as a lot of it's very challenging and it's very uncomfortable for the staff to get involved in this. But if you're not willing to create those spaces of uncomfort, you're not going to reach a point of insight. You're not going to reach a point where you can change. And finally, final example is Seth here, who is a principal in the UK, in the United States, in a school. Also, by the way, a school for people who are. It's a high school for kids who've dropped out of the school system, and many have dropped out twice, 2 years. And now it's like their final chance since high school. And the way that he and his colleagues worked with the future was basically to say, how would we create a radically different future for the school where it's as digital as possible? And in this process, one of the quotes was, what could be more crazy? How can we create a future that's really, really radical? And they did this as part of a workshop organized by the policy department, by the Department for Education in New York. And when they set that vision for the digital school, the department said, together with the design team, that's great, that's a crazy vision. Why don't you take a flip camera and some tools here and go back and come back to the school and come back 2 weeks from now and give us a film about it. Show us a film about that day-to-day life in the day in the life of a student, where that realization of this new digital working and learning environment is a reality. And that's what they did. Here's a photo from the film. And today that school has digitized every learning material. And every kid has their individual online schedule, which means that the learning is 100% individual, at least in terms of learning progress. They still work in groups, they work in classrooms, but they also work on an individual scheduling. Think about that. I don't think you have that in Sweden. We don't have it in Denmark. It means that every child has his or her own pace in terms of learning and progression in school. But that's not the point of the story, that they transform the school that way for these kids. The point of the story is that to do so, to have a digital learning environment in schools, they had to change policy. They had to change regulation in the state of New York. Because what do you think happens if a kid is sitting at Starbucks? A high school kid is sitting at Starbucks and learning online. You're tardy from school. You're not present in the school. You're not in the physical location, and you'll get marks, and you'll get kicked out of school, actually. So they had to change regulation in the state of New York to say that you can have online presence, you can have online school presence. And that regulation is nicknamed after the name of the school. That's Design for Policy to me. I'll skip this because I think we should have time for questions, and then we can talk about government labs and that whole thing afterwards. Questions, remarks, protests? Yes. Oh, we have digital questions.
Yay.
All right. That's also more comfortable because then we don't. Yeah. All right.
We don't only have real people, we have digital things.
We have digital people.
Are public bodies usually open to working with design processes, since design will challenge given facts and ways of doing things?
Try to say that once again.
Are public bodies usually open to working with design processes?
So you're saying, are public bodies open to change, to trying something totally new that they haven't done before? I would say that to some extent, the best that's happened to government was the financial crisis and the lack of funding, at least in many countries, also in Denmark, because it meant the government was ready to try something new. And maybe there's also a bit of a generational shift happening in government that might also open some cracks, because there's a new sort of, also very digital, by the way, sort of cadre coming in. But I would say, generally speaking, it's changing, but I think it's still difficult. And what is most difficult is that government organizations actually do have their ways of doing projects, right? They have a very linear, stage-gated way of doing development work. And you've come in with a design task, suddenly it's a different process and it involves users in different ways. And I've had to shut down projects at MindLab where government organizations were not ready. They were simply not ready or comfortable with involving end users in their work, which means that they were not comfortable asking themselves whether what they were developing would ever work in practice. And honestly, at some point in your life, your time is just too short for that kind of thing. So I think the big trick for those of you who want to work more with government and with design is to discover and find the leaders and the staff that are curious, that are open and curious and interested in trying something different, and basically curious to create a change for someone else than themselves. For someone else than themselves.
They're coming here now. How do you make it stick? That's a short
good.
one.
So how do you make it stick? So that was the slide with the test tube on. So I think that there's a huge untapped potential or gap as a government market for design, where governments need to hire in more designers. But also say that it is true that lawyers tend to hire lawyers, political scientists tend to hire political scientists as consultants, as advisors. So if this is going to shift really in government, we also need to get more designers inside government to work within the structures of government organizations, ideally at a quite high level. And that is why making design stick in government is right now, and this is positive, powered by the establishment of innovation labs, innovation teams, policy labs. And this is the UK government in the Cabinet Office. This is the government of Chile across 10 different ministries with the president sort of sponsoring it. It is Angela Merkel in Germany that is setting up a small behavioral insights team. It's not so much design as it's more like design research, but it's basically a small team referring to the Chancellor of Germany. It's Singapore, it's Mindlab in Denmark, it's national cities, Mexico City, Boston, and so on. There's a whole range. It's been featured now in The Economist that was the image I had with the test tube from The Economist. It's basically a global trend that governments are investing in particular spaces and places and capabilities to do this. So that is, I think, a powerful way of getting started. It is not the way ultimately to make design stick across the board, but it is a way of embedding design at a strategic level. And I think it's really important, and I think it's about time that you here in Sweden got going on that as well, both at national level, but also at local level. It's my impression that you haven't moved as fast on this agenda as a lot of other countries, including Denmark, and you don't want to be overtaken by Denmark now, do you?
I suggest, we actually had some suggestions from Twitter. You know, sitting is the new smoking. So I think we better wrap up this very interesting speech of yours today, Christian. And we would like to give you this. It's some chocolate for all the fika you are having when you're doing prototyping.
We do drink a lot of coffee in Denmark too, so I'll
and let's give Christian a big applause and thank you.
Thanks, man.